I let my cheating husband believe he was winning our divorce for 4 months. Right up until a clause buried on page 11 of the prenup he'd barely skimmed wiped out his claim to millions from my surgical practice. My name is Rachel Ford, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. My father used to say that one of the most dangerous habits a smart person can develop is assuming everyone else in the room is a step behind them. He said it so often that, for years, I barely heard it anymore. It was the kind of warning that lived in the background of my life, like a smoke detector battery that got tested every so often and then forgotten. He said it again the week before my wedding. We were sitting in his kitchen, with paperwork spread between the salt shaker and a half-empty cup of coffee, and he was reading through the prenuptial agreement he had insisted on helping me prepare. He had the same expression he always got when he was reading a contract he expected someone else to misunderstand. Calm, patient, slightly annoyed on my behalf. I was 29 then, in love, tired, and still young enough to think caution was something other people needed more than I did. "You know this doesn't mean I think badly of Grant," he said without looking up. "I know. It means I think people are people. That's all." I laughed and told him he sounded like he was about to cross-examine my groom. He just adjusted his glasses and pointed at a paragraph on page 11. "I'm serious, Rachel. The expensive mistake is believing you can outfeel the facts." At the time, I rolled my eyes. I kissed his cheek, thanked him for his concern, and went back to planning centerpieces and seating charts. I thought the prenup was a formality, one of those practical things that rich, careful adults do while pretending they are still romantic. I thought Grant and I were different, because we were good together, because he was kind, because he had stood beside me through the worst years of my residency with a steadiness that felt almost miraculous. 8 years later, sitting across from him in a mediation room, while he tried to walk away with half the appreciation of the practice I had built, I realized my father had not been being dramatic. He had been teaching me how to survive. I was a surgeon before I was a divorced woman. I was a wife before I understood that marriage can contain secrets large enough to alter the shape of your entire future. And for 4 months, I let my cheating husband believe he was winning our divorce. I let him believe it right up until the exact moment a clause buried on page 11 of a document he barely skimmed destroyed the entire strategy he and his lawyer had built. Grant Whitaker and I met when I was still in surgical residency. I was living on caffeine, adrenaline, and the particular kind of exhaustion that makes you feel as though your own body belongs to someone else. My days were 12 to 16 hours long. My nights were often spent in fluorescent hallways waiting for test results, and my idea of a good week was one where I made it through without crying in a supply closet or snapping at a senior resident who deserved better. Grant worked in consulting then, which meant his schedule was chaotic enough to understand mine without quite matching it. He had a way of showing up that made me feel seen instead of burdened. He never acted offended when I canceled dinner because a trauma case ran late. He never turned my career into a competition with his own. If I was stuck in the hospital past midnight, he would appear with coffee in a paper cup, a sandwich he knew I'd never actually have time to eat, and a joke designed to make me smile when I hadn't had energy left for that in days. He was patient in a way that felt rare. That patience mattered to me because I had seen what resentment looked like in other relationships. I had watched coworkers shrink themselves to keep the peace at home. I had seen smart, accomplished women apologize for the size of their own lives. Grant never made me do that. He seemed proud of me. He told people what I did with a kind of warm admiration that made me feel like I was standing in a light I had earned. We dated through the end of residency, through my fellowship, and through the first few shaky years after I joined a private practice that specialized in complex surgical care. The practice was not huge when I came in. It was respected but modest, the sort of group where every new patient mattered and every good referral had a noticeable impact. I bought in with money my father helped me structure and protect, and over the years my caseload increased, my reputation improved, and the practice grew along with it. Some of that growth was mine alone. Some of it was the result of a wider expansion in the local healthcare market. Some of it came from smart investments. My father insisted I start early, though he phrased it as a suggestion and a lesson instead of a command. He was a corporate litigator for 30 years. He trusted contracts more than feelings and spreadsheets more than assumptions. I used to tease him about it. He would always answer with the same line: "Feelings are not a substitute for terms." Grant and I married 4 years after we met. The wedding was beautiful, though I remember it now less as a perfect day, and more as a day saturated with the nervous relief of people who think they have solved something permanent. My mother cried during the vows. My sister nearly fainted during the toasts. Grant kissed me in front of everyone as if he had been waiting all his life to do it. The prenuptial agreement was not his idea. It was my father's condition for helping fund my share of the practice buy-in, and I was too grateful for his support, too confident in Grant, and too young in the specific way that makes caution feel insulting, to push back hard. Grant didn't fight it much. His lawyer reviewed it. Mine reviewed it. I signed it because my father asked me to, and because I was embarrassed by how deeply I took the implication that love might not be enough. I remember Grant sliding his copy back into its folder after he signed it. He smiled at me and said, "Your dad is thorough. He means well." I know. At the time, I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Buried in the document, among the provisions on separate property and division of assets, was a clause my father's firm had used for years in prenups for high-earning professionals. It said that appreciation in marital assets would be divided under standard equitable distribution rules unless one spouse could be shown, by clear and convincing evidence, to have committed a material breach of the marital relationship through infidelity. If that happened, the unfaithful spouse forfeited any claim to the appreciation in the other spouse's separate and professional assets accumulated during the marriage. My father had once explained the logic to me as if he were teaching a junior associate a point of law. "It isn't about punishing cheating in some theatrical, moralistic sense," he said. "It's about fairness. If one partner spends the marriage building a career, a practice, an asset base, and the other partner chooses to step outside the relationship, they don't get to help themselves to the growth they had no honest part in creating. People think betrayal is emotional only. It is often financial." I remember thinking he was being bleak. I also remember now that he was being precise. The first crack in my marriage did not announce itself as a crack. It came in little absences. Grant was still affectionate, still functional, still present enough, if you weren't looking too closely. But over time his attention began to slide in ways I could feel before I could name. He worked later. He traveled more. He stopped volunteering the details of those trips unless I asked directly. He seemed tired in a way that had less to do with work than with being elsewhere in his own mind. Some nights he sat at dinner and answered questions too quickly, as if I had interrupted a conversation already happening somewhere else. I told myself it was stress. I told myself every marriage had seasons. I was still working brutal hours, and I had patients and staff and a list of obligations that left little room for suspicion. I was not the kind of woman who checked phones or stalked social media accounts or interrogated a spouse over every odd mood. I had too much experience seeing real crises to invent fake ones. Then, in February, 11 months before the mediation that would end it all, I found the expense report. It was accidental. The kind of thing that would be dismissed as insignificant if it hadn't changed everything. Our household accounting was partly joint. I handled some of the bills. Grant handled others. We had a shared email account for certain recurring statements and calendar invites, and one afternoon a corporate card report from Grant's consulting firm was forwarded there by mistake. I was not snooping. I was looking for a utility receipt. The report included a hotel charge in a city where Grant had supposedly been attending a conference. The reservation name on the room was not his. It belonged to a woman named Lauren Cole. I knew Lauren. Not well, but well enough to place her. She worked at Grant's firm. I had met her twice at company events and remembered her because she had laughed at nearly everything he said in a way that struck me as unusually receptive. The memory became sharp in my mind the moment I saw her name, not because I had suspected her, because I had not. I sat there in the kitchen staring at that statement while the house got quiet around me. Grant was asleep upstairs. The dishwasher hummed. A car passed outside. The world kept moving in the ordinary way while something in me rearranged itself. For a few minutes I was not even angry. I was cold. Then I was angry, but not in a dramatic way. Not yet. More like my body understood before my heart did that something irreversible had happened. I opened the rest of the statement. Then I checked the date of the hotel charge against Grant's calendar, which showed a conference in another city. Then I checked a few other line items and found more oddities, small at first, then harder to dismiss. A dinner charge that did not fit. A rideshare at midnight. A second hotel stay 3 weeks later. I sat with the evidence for almost 2 hours, and in those 2 hours I thought about my father's voice. I thought about the prenup. I thought about all the years I had spent believing that the worst kind of betrayal was the kind you could spot immediately, loud and obvious and crude. What I was looking at was quieter than that, more controlled, more deliberate, the kind of betrayal that hides inside a calendar and a reimbursement form. I did not confront Grant that night. That decision is one of the few things in my life I have never second-guessed. Confronting him then would have told him what I knew before I knew enough. It would have given him time to destroy messages, rewrite history, prepare excuses, and maybe even recruit Lauren into a cleaner version of the story. I knew enough about human behavior and enough about litigation to understand that a confrontation without proof is mostly a gift to the person lying to you. So I said nothing. I made dinner. I answered his questions. I kissed him goodnight. Inside, I felt as if I were walking around with a broken bone and no one else could see it. The next morning, I called Marcus Diallo. Marcus had been recommended to me by a colleague who had used him during a difficult divorce 2 years earlier. He was a former detective with a reputation for being methodical, quiet, and impossible to rattle. I told him I needed facts, not vibes, not rumors, not speculation. I needed evidence strong enough to stand up in court. He asked whether I wanted to know the truth or use it. I remember pausing before answering. Both, I said. Marcus did not waste time. He understood exactly what I needed. He began by mapping Grant's usual travel patterns, office hours, and social calendar. He verified hotel records, restaurant receipts, public location overlaps, and the little repeating gaps in Grant's official story. He worked quietly and legally, building a picture I could use if the time came. And while he worked, I played the role of the wife who had not yet been wounded. That part was harder than I expected. I am good in emergencies. In surgery, panic is not a luxury. You cannot let your hand shake because someone else is bleeding. You learn to become exact, calm, controlled. Marriage is not like surgery. In marriage, the injury is hidden. You do not get the clean geometry of an incision or the clarity of a scan. You get a feeling in your stomach, and a gap in a story, and the slow realization that your own home has become a place where you are being lied to. I kept my face steady. I kept working. I kept sleeping in the same bed as Grant, while Marcus assembled proof that my husband was leading a second life. Some nights I would lie awake and replay every recent interaction, trying to see where the story changed. Was there a moment I should have noticed? Had he been emotionally gone before I ever saw the first invoice? Had I been too busy saving strangers to notice my own marriage slipping into someone else's hands? The honest answer was yes and no. Yes, I had been busy. No, that did not mean I had been stupid. The affair did not begin as a giant dramatic secret. It was a series of choices, meetings that ran late, messages that should not have existed, a hotel room booked under another name, another city, another excuse. Marcus built the timeline over 3 months, and the picture he delivered was worse than I expected in one very specific way. This was not new. It had been going on for nearly 2 years. Nearly 2 years. That meant all the small distance I had felt in retrospect was not my imagination. The canceled anniversary dinner, the sudden work trips, the distracted silences, the times he looked at his phone and smiled in a way that had nothing to do with me. It also meant that by the time I found the expense report, the marriage had already been partly hollowed out. Grant was still the first to file for divorce. That still makes me angry. It happened on a Sunday evening in June. He came home with the kind of expression people wear when they have rehearsed a speech and want it to land gently. He asked if we could talk in the living room. He sat at the far end of the couch. He folded his hands. Then he told me we had grown apart. He said it carefully, like he expected me to accept the phrase because it sounded mature. He said he had been unhappy for a while. He said he thought we both deserved honesty. He said he hoped we could handle this like adults. I remember staring at him and thinking how strange it was that he could sit there and perform heartbreak with such confidence when I already knew exactly what he was protecting. He did not know I had the hotel records. He did not know I had Marcus. He did not know that the moment he started talking, I was already holding the answer to every lie he was about to tell. The most difficult part was not letting my face give him the satisfaction of seeing how little he controlled the situation. I told him I was shocked. I told him I needed time. I told him I didn't understand what had gone wrong, and he looked almost relieved, which more than anything confirmed what I already knew. He had wanted this exit to feel clean. He had wanted to be the reasonable one. He had wanted the moral high ground while someone else paid for the wreckage. The next week, I called Elaine Cho. Elaine had worked with my father years earlier. She was the kind of attorney who made bad intentions look sloppy just by entering the room. Understated, precise, no wasted words. When I laid out the situation, the affair, the prenup, the evidence, she listened without interrupting, which was somehow more unnerving than if she had reacted immediately. When I finished, she leaned back and asked one question. Do you want him punished, or do you want to protect the assets? I did not answer right away, because if I answered honestly, it was both. But what I really needed was the second. Protect the assets, I said. Elaine nodded once, as if she had expected that. Then we do this correctly, not emotionally, correctly. She explained what the next months would require. Patience, silence, discipline. She told me that if we used the evidence too early, Grant's side would have time to adjust. If he knew how much we had, he would spend money trying to bury it. He might settle differently, he might lawyer up harder, he might create distractions. We needed him overconfident. We needed him thinking I was hurt, disorganized, and easy to pressure. That would require me to act more broken than I felt. I told her I could do that, and I did. For 4 months, Elaine and I let Grant and his attorney, Peter Voss, believe they were dealing with a woman who was too grief-stricken to fight properly. Peter was polished in the way some lawyers are polished when they believe they have the stronger hand. He was not a bad attorney. That is what made him dangerous. He was competent, experienced, and slightly condescending, especially toward women he assumed were emotional and financially distracted. Grant, through Peter, opened the negotiation with a demand for an equal share of the appreciation in my practice's value over the marriage. That request was not small. Over 8 years, my practice had grown substantially. My income had increased. My investments had appreciated. The practice itself had become one of the most valuable parts of my financial life. Grant wanted half of the growth, even though he had contributed nothing directly to the expansion beyond the general support one spouse gives another while living together. If he had succeeded, he would have walked away with millions. Elaine responded with soft, cautious counteroffers. Not because we lacked confidence, but because we wanted to let Grant believe he was wearing me down. We wanted him to feel successful enough to keep talking. We wanted him to think the leverage was moving in his direction. It worked better than I expected. At the first meeting, Grant looked wounded. By the second, he looked patient. By the third, he looked almost gracious. He told Elaine that he did not want this to become ugly. He said he hoped I would eventually see reason. He said he was willing to be fair. I sat through those meetings with my hands folded in my lap, dabbing at my eyes at the exact right moments, saying little, looking tired, looking sad, looking like a woman who was losing her marriage and struggling to make decisions in real time. It was exhausting. Not because I was pretending to feel something I did not. I did feel grief, real grief. What I was pretending was that the grief made me weak enough to be careless. At night, I would come home and stand in the bathroom with the door closed, staring at my own reflection and practicing my face. Neutral. Hurt. Confused. A little too fragile to argue. Elaine had suggested I keep tissues in my bag and use them strategically if necessary, and the suggestion had sounded absurd until I realized how useful it was to have one visible object in the room that reinforced the story he wanted to believe. Meanwhile, Marcus kept adding to the file. He documented 11 separate occasions where Grant and Lauren met outside work hours. 4 of those included hotel stays that left no plausible innocent explanation. He collected hotel records, photographs, publicly available travel overlap, restaurant receipts, and patterns of phone activity that told a clear story without requiring melodrama. He also traced the relationship back further than I expected, confirming it had started nearly 2 years earlier. When he delivered that final detail, I had to sit down. I had told myself there would be a moment when the truth felt clean once it was fully known. It didn't. It felt worse, in a more organized way. The betrayal had not been one impulsive lapse. It had been a parallel life. It meant he had spent holidays with me while building another emotional center elsewhere. It meant he had kissed me goodnight while lying to my face. It meant the person I had believed was sharing a life with me had been for a long time carefully splitting himself into compartments. I did not cry when Marcus said it. I cried later, alone, in the shower, with the water loud enough that no one could hear me. The mediation was set for a Tuesday in October. By then, Grant and Peter were convinced the pressure had worked. They had seen enough reluctance in my responses to believe I was near collapse. Grant's confidence had shifted into something almost smug, the kind of confidence people get when they mistake politeness for surrender. He probably thought I was exhausted, embarrassed, and ready to trade away more than I should simply to end the discomfort. He had no idea that Elaine and I had spent weeks preparing the exact moment we intended to pull the floor out from under him. The morning of the mediation, I wore a navy suit, low heels, and the same watch I wore to difficult surgeries. It was a small ritual of control. Elaine met me in the lobby and reviewed the packet one more time. The evidence was organized in the order we wanted Peter to experience it. First the clause, then the breach standard, then the records that made the standard impossible to dodge. We did not want surprise for surprise's sake. We wanted inevitability. The mediation room was worse than most conference rooms because it was intentionally designed to feel neutral, which somehow made it colder. Fluorescent lights, a long table, water glasses nobody touched. Grant sat beside Peter in a gray suit and looked, for the first time in months, almost relaxed. That was the moment I knew he had truly convinced himself this was going to work. Peter opened with a settlement proposal that would have granted Grant nearly half of the appreciated value of my practice, close to $2.8 million. He framed it as reasonable. He used the language of fairness, shared life, mutual sacrifice. He spoke as if we were two adults simply figuring out a clean end to a long marriage. Elaine let him talk. Then she asked him to pause before anyone signed anything. She opened her own folder, laid it on the table, and said very calmly that before they went any further, she needed to address a provision in the prenuptial agreement. She called it by page number. Page 11. The room changed immediately. You could feel it in the air. Grant frowned first, then looked at Peter, then back at Elaine. Peter's expression shifted from irritation to caution. Elaine read the clause aloud in the same level tone she used for everything else. She explained the standard. She explained the breach requirement. She explained the consequence. Then she put the evidence packet on the table. Hotel records, photographs, date stamps, phone logs. Travel overlap. The documentation Marcus had assembled into a chain strong enough to survive challenge. Grant's face changed in real time. I will never forget that. It was not one dramatic expression. It was several small ones, one after the other. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, panic. Then the dawning realization that the room had become a trap and he was the one inside it. He looked at me then, not at Elaine, not at Peter. He looked at me as if I had personally broken some sacred agreement by preparing for the possibility that he might lie. How long? He asked. His voice was low but not steady. Since February, I said. It was the first direct sentence I had spoken to him in the entire process. The silence after that was almost physical. Peter asked for a recess immediately, which is what competent lawyers do when their client's strategy has just disintegrated on the table in front of them. Grant stood up too fast, then sat back down, then rubbed his face with both hands. He looked smaller than he had an hour before. I did not feel triumphant. That is one of the truths of this story I wish people understood better. I felt calm, not happy, not vindicated. Calm, because the thing I had feared for months had finally become legible and therefore manageable. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When they returned, the settlement proposal had changed. It changed a lot. Grant's side tried first to argue that the clause was unfair. Then they tried to argue that it had not been properly explained to him at signing. Then they tried to argue that it was too old, too punitive, too one-sided to enforce as written. Elaine had expected all of it. She produced the file notes from my father's firm showing that Grant had been given the agreement 2 weeks before the wedding. She produced proof of independent counsel. She produced case law from our state supporting similar provisions where both parties had counsel and time to review. She showed that the clause was not some hidden trap shoved at Grant minutes before the ceremony. It had been there, reviewed, signed, and documented. Grant had simply not believed it would ever matter. That was his mistake. Over the next 2 months, his attorney tried to challenge the enforceability in court. The arguments were predictable. Elaine answered each one with the kind of calm precision that makes panic impossible to maintain. The judge reviewed the evidence and upheld the clause at the first contested hearing. Grant lost his claim to the appreciation in my practice. He walked away with his separate property intact, and nothing from the growth he had tried to take from me. He did not get half. He did not get leverage. He got the consequence of assuming he had outmaneuvered the one document he had barely bothered to read. The relief I felt after the ruling was not clean, either. There was satisfaction, yes. There was also grief. Years of marriage do not evaporate just because a judge agrees you were wronged. I had spent enough time with people in life-altering crises to know that endings are rarely neat. Even victories can feel like loss if the thing you won back is the ability to stop pretending. For a while after the hearing, I was just tired. There is a special kind of tired that comes from living with sustained restraint. You have to manage your face, your tone, your instincts, your hopes, your rage. You have to sit in rooms with people who are trying to extract value from your pain and remain articulate. That kind of discipline costs something. I do not regret it. But I also do not romanticize it. Winning was not a cinematic surge of joy. It was the first real exhale I had taken in months. Grant and Lauren are together now, as far as I know. Mutual acquaintances have occasionally passed along the sort of updates people think are harmless. I have not asked for them. I have no desire to know the daily architecture of the life he built on top of the one he was dismantling. I hope, in the complicated way you sometimes hope for people who hurt you, that whatever they have is honest in a way my marriage no longer was. That is not forgiveness. It is simply the point at which I decided not to carry them around in my own mind any longer than necessary. I kept the house, I kept the practice, I kept my financial future intact. And once the dust settled, I used part of the settlement money to start a scholarship fund at the medical school where I did my residency. It is earmarked for women pursuing surgical specialties. That decision mattered to me more than I expected. It was not about Grant. It was about taking a year that had otherwise been filled with betrayal and giving it a direction that pointed somewhere useful. The first time I met one of the recipients, I almost had to leave the dinner early because I was so unexpectedly moved. She was bright, nervous, and completely unaware of how much I saw of my younger self in her. A year later, there were 2 recipients. By then, the scholarship had become something real and ongoing, not just a reaction to pain. That is what made the difference for me. Not revenge, not even the courtroom win. Something that lasted longer than the marriage and did not depend on the person who destroyed it. My father lived long enough to see the case resolve. I still remember telling him about the mediation. He laughed so hard when I described Peter's face as Elaine opened the packet that he had to set down his glass and wipe his eyes. I had not heard him laugh like that in years. He told me the clause had lived in the template for over a decade before I ever needed it. He said it had originally been drafted for another client, a woman whose circumstances he never fully shared with me, and that he never imagined his own daughter would be the one to prove it in open mediation. There was pride in his voice, but also something gentler than pride. Relief, maybe, or the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent his career believing that careful work matters even when it looks overly cautious to everyone else. I think about that conversation often now. I think about how much of his inheritance was not money at all, but judgment, patience, the ability to read a document slowly enough to understand what was really there, the ability to separate what feels urgent from what actually needs to happen. The hardest part of the 4 months leading up to the mediation was not Grant. It was everyone else. My sister knew something was wrong, of course. She showed up with meal deliveries and questions she could tell I was not ready to answer. She kept looking at me with the kind of worry that makes you want to protect the person who is trying to protect you. Every time she came by, I had to leave the room for a minute so she wouldn't see how close I was to breaking character. Elaine had been adamant that fewer people knew, the better. Not because my family would have betrayed me, because even loving people can accidentally leak the wrong detail to the wrong ear at the wrong moment. The night after the mediation, I called my sister and told her everything. She was silent for a long time. Then she said, very carefully, "If I ever see him in public, I may lose my profession." That made me laugh for the first time in weeks. It also made me cry. At the hospital, a few colleagues noticed that I was not fully myself. Not that I was falling apart in public. I was too trained for that. But there is a kind of distance that appears when you are carrying private devastation. One attending physician, Dr. Anand, who had gone through her own brutal divorce years earlier, pulled me aside one afternoon and simply told me she recognized the look. She did not ask for details. She just said if I ever needed someone who understood the particular loneliness of holding it together in front of patients while your own life burns quietly in the background, her door was open. I have never forgotten that. People imagine betrayal as a spectacular event. It is not. Most of it is logistics. Most of it is waiting. Most of it is sitting in ordinary places while the truth gathers force beneath the surface. I also learned something uncomfortable about Grant that I do not love admitting. The version of him who married me was not fake. He had been real. He had been kind, affectionate, patient, and supportive for years. He had sat through long nights and celebrated my milestones and held my hand at funerals and appeared at the hospital with coffee when I needed it most. That history does not disappear just because he became someone capable of cheating. That complexity is what made the betrayal harder, not easier. It would have been simpler if he had been terrible from the beginning. Instead, he was the kind of person you could love deeply and still need to protect yourself from. That distinction matters. It matters because healing is easier when you can flatten the other person into a monster. Real life is rarely that clean. Sometimes the person who hurts you is still capable of kindness. Sometimes the person who loved you also lied to you. Sometimes both things are true, and you have to build your future in the space between them. Elaine and I still have lunch a few times a year. At one of those lunches, she told me that my case had become something she used as a teaching example for younger associates, not because it was flashy, but because it illustrated how much discipline it takes to wait until the evidence is complete. She said most people can manage that for a few days, very few can manage it for months. I told her I had not felt disciplined, I had felt numb, angry, tired, occasionally terrified. She smiled and said that was what discipline usually looks like from the inside. That answer stayed with me. Because discipline, when you are inside it, does not feel noble. It feels like not texting someone you want to scream at. It feels like not speaking when speaking would be emotionally satisfying and strategically stupid. It feels like making coffee while your heart is still actively breaking. I still have my father's original prenup file in a box of his papers. I have not fully gone through since he died. Sometimes I think about opening it. There are notes in his handwriting. There are probably comments about the client who inspired the clause. There are probably observations I have never seen. Reminders to himself about why he insisted on including it. One day I will read it properly, not because I need to relive what happened, because some part of me still wants to understand the architecture of the protection he gave me before I ever knew I would need it. What I tell people now, when the story comes up in shortened form at a dinner party or through a friend of a friend, is not really a lesson about prenups. It is not even mainly a lesson about infidelity. It is this: being right about someone's betrayal is rarely enough on its own. What protects you is the patience to gather proof of it fully, quietly, and completely before you let the person who hurt you see you coming. Grant thought he was winning because I looked hurt, because I waited, because I did not explode on command. He mistook restraint for weakness. That is the expensive mistake my father warned me about. And thanks to him, I learned how to make patience do its work.